the scholars for research. So this is very good news, and I'm really very grateful for that in person. I thank you very much for your attention. So yes, thank you, Nehemia, for your kind introduction. I am a paleographer, and I'm going to talk about this codex as a material object. Um, can I share my screen? Yes. Yes. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. Can I continue? Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm not going to introduce the history, the modern history of the Codex, because I think that it is going to be done later today in the day. I'm going to focus on the materiality of the Codex and the potential of the materiality of the Codex to inform us about its history. As we have heard yesterday, the Codex is one of the most important witnesses to the Hebrew text. But the Hebrew text does not exist in abstract. The Hebrew text is studied, copied, transmitted, read, chanted, used in liturgy by Jewish people in specific historical contexts throughout its history. So study the text without history is very important, very interesting, but it's only a part of the picture. So in order to complete the picture, it is important to try to understand when a specific biblical or other book, codex, was produced and what kind of Jewish communities studied it and used it. So we are talking about a very large manuscript. Here you have a picture of me, which was taken in the offices of Sotheby's in London. I'm showing it to you to show you the proportions, how large the manuscript is. Indeed, it is almost 40 centimeters tall, and it weighs, and this is very important, almost 12 kilograms. We don't always appreciate how heavy the objects are. When we hear about their weight, we realize that these are really physical objects, which were difficult to carry by, by people in the Middle Ages as they are for us today. So clearly, it is not a book that you would read, you know, for leisure or in your bed before going to sleep. It was really a book of study. So it contains today 396 folios. It is written on Oriental type of parchment, rack parchment, and most probably, I haven't studied the ink, but it is iron gall based with some admixture of carbon, which corresponds to the majority of inks that we find in the Cairo Geniza or other Oriental manuscripts. The manuscript was damaged and restored at least twice. It was as well bound at least once before the modern binding. It is quite difficult to study the manuscript from the point of view of its structure today because during the last rebinding, the order of the folios of the quires was not changed, but the quires were rebound differently. So it is a large format. It is taller than narrower. You can see the vertical proportions. However, the written space in 3 columns for most of the text and 2 very large columns. Hello? Oh, yes, okay, fine. I thought that someone was trying to tell me something. So a large text, vertical proportions, 3 columns per page for most of the text, and for the book Emet, 2 large columns per page. However, despite the verticality of the codex as it is now, when you look at the written space, especially without the Masoretic notes, it is almost square. And given that the manuscript was trimmed very heavily, when you see the margins have almost disappeared during several rebindings of the text, it is likely that the dimensions were much, much larger and that the proportions were slightly different and more square from what we see today. So as I said, the manuscript was heavily restored. So the restoration concerns pieces of pages that disappeared, that were damaged, so they were probably cut off at some point, and different pieces of parchment were attached, stitched to them in order to restore the regular size of the pages. The parchment which was used for restoration was sometimes reused from other texts. So we have pieces of parchment with Hebrew writing on them. So we have another Jewish manuscript that was recycled in order to restore this manuscript. The restoration patches contain the script which can be dated to the 14th century. So we know that the restoration has taken part later. We know as well that the restoration with stitching patches of parchment took place at least twice, probably for the first time in the 12th, 13th century and the second time in the 14th. So this is a part of the history of the manuscript that we can reconstruct from reconstruction. So this is quite interesting. In addition to adding pieces of parchment, the scribe went over the script. Very often, the script faded, the writing faded on many pages, especially on the flesh side. The flesh side of the parchment keeps the ink much less well than the hair side of the parchment. So on many pages, the writing was damaged, almost probably illegible. So another scribe, much later, went over the letters, which sometimes on many pages makes the paleographical identification problematic. However, it was possible for some of the pages. The manuscript is composed of 42 quires, gatherings of parchment. It was not easy to reconstruct them, as I told you, but with Shaul Zeidler, who I think is here, together we worked very hard and came to the conclusion that indeed the majority of the quires, gatherings, were composed of 5 bifolios. That means 10 folios and 20 pages, and that a very large majority of the beginning of the manuscript is missing. It can be seen because the text is missing. The beginning of Bereshit is missing in the manuscript, but we see that there were at least 5 folios before the beginning of the text that were missing. And this is a great pity because something was written on this folio. So we can only dream that maybe there were decorative carpet pages like in many other Oriental manuscripts, and maybe there were some notes which could inform us about the origin of the manuscript, the scribe, or the owner. Unfortunately, today, the historical information about the creation of the manuscript, the colophon of the scribe, is not preserved. If it was ever written, we don't have it today. So we rely on paleography, on the study of the text, and on C14 dating, which dates the Bible to the 9th or the beginning of the 10th century, in order to date the manuscript. To reconstruct the composition of the book, how the book was made, we are helped by the presence of notes, of marks, which were added twice in the history of the manuscript, much later than the manuscript itself. So we have the numbers of the quires. The quires are numbered. We call it signature. In the corner, right-hand upper corner of the beginning of every quire, we have a number in Hebrew characters with these 3 dots in order to tell us this is the quire number. It was added probably in the 13th century or even later. So I would date it to the 13th century. These notes, and we are going to come back to them. We have another type of notes in the manuscript, which reflect probably the binder's notes when the manuscript was bound. Before the present binding, we don't have the original binding, but we know that it existed because we have traces of stitching, binding stitching in the manuscript, but also we have these amazing notes, as you can see here, which were not left by a Jewish hand, but rather by Christian binding. So we find this kind of notes in Oriental Arabic manuscripts, which are related to the production of manuscripts in Syria, and with the binding in Christian monasteries, and these symbols probably derive from Georgian letters, which were used by Christian binders working in Christian monasteries. So it is likely, although we can't prove it for the time being, that throughout its history, in later medieval period, the manuscript was bound by Christian workshop. So it is possible that its owners simply ordered a new binding with local specialists. So we still don't know really who these local specialists were and of what geographical location we are talking. So as we all know already, the text is written in 3 columns with Masora Parva and Masora Magna written by 2 Masoretes at different stages. So we are going to talk about it when we talk about paleography. What is interesting in the manuscript, it has a tradition of text which separates between different parts of the text, different biblical books, by blank space within the text. There are no initials, there are no titles, there is nothing, no decorative larger letters to signal the beginning of the new book. However, what is usually happen is that the end of the previous book, here we have the beginning of the book of Joshua, we have a complete Bible, so we have different biblical books, we can talk about different techniques. The title Joshua was added much later. It's not original. However, what is interesting to signal the beginning of the new book is that the end of the text of the previous book was written by lines of 2 with spaces between the lines, so that when the reader comes to the end of the book can say, aha, that's the end of the book, I'm going to begin a new book. And this tradition is attested in other Oriental and some Sephardi manuscripts as well. We spoke yesterday about the lines of the text and the text arrangement, so I'm not going to discuss it in any detail today. I would like to point out to quite unusual, very interesting page layout of Shirat Hayam, Exodus 15, in 30 lines of text. And yes, and especially I would like to point out to the page layout of Shirat Ha'azinu, which is written in 2 large columns, each one subdivided in hemistichs. So in fact, visually, we see 4 columns of text. And it is written in 72 lines, which does not correspond to the tradition which is represented by Aleppo Codex, where we find 67 lines of text. The Aleppo Codex, the scribe, has opted for a different layout, where on the large page there is only 1 column of text of Ha'azinu, which creates these large blank spaces between the hemistichs. So it's very different from Sassoon Codex, which is written in a much more dense way. So 67 lines of the Shirat Ha'azinu, as you know, correspond to Mishneh Torah Maimonides, as we think. This was the Aleppo Codex that was used for Maimonides. This is why Maimonides is talking about Shirat Ha'azinu in fact, Sheva v'Shishim Shitot. The printed editions have, of course, as we all know, 70 lines, but this is a completely different story. The the manuscript Huntington 80, which was in Bodleian Library, which was corrected by Maimonides himself, contains 67 lines, like in the Aleppo Codex. It is different from Sassoon Codex, so we see that the scribe followed a different model or different tradition. So the history of the manuscript. There is no colophon, as I said, so we need to reconstruct the history differently from paleography, techniques, text, as I told you. But also, unfortunately, we have a few documents which were written in the manuscript by the subsequent owners of the manuscript. So first of all, we have a deed of sale. We don't have a date of this deed of sale. However, I think already Sassoon himself in his catalog, Ohel David, identified one of the protagonists, the seller of the manuscript. So the manuscript was written by a scribe whose name was Tzedakah ben Daniel of Jerusalem, Yerushalmi. And he wrote this document. You see this document here. He wrote this document for Khalaf ben Avraham, who was a business partner of someone whose name was Sheikh Abu Said Eli ben Hanania al-Sirafi. Sirafi, the money changer. It was the name of the profession. So the codex was sold by this consortium of two partners to Isaac ben Ezekiel al-Attar. Al-Attar, the perfumer. So in each case, we have the name of the profession, and in each case, so the money changer or the banker or the perfumer are professions of a very high social standing. Of course, the codex, the complete codex of the Bible, we have some prices from the Cairo Geniza. The most expensive codex of the Bible in the early 13th century was sold for 37.5 gold dinars. We have other mentions which place the ranges of the full Bible, especially in the book lists from the Cairo Geniza, published by Aloni and then republished by Haggai ben Shammai, Miriam Frankel, and Moshe Sokolov. So we have prices of the Bibles, and the price range of the full Bible is between 10 and 37 gold dinars. When we think that at the time under consideration, a house would be bought for between 20 and 50 dinars, it's indeed a very, very high price to pay for the book. So selling such a book or buying such a book was an event. It was a very important commercial operation. So it was already Sassoon in his catalog Ohel David who identified Khalaf ben Avraham, the business partner, one of the sellers, with a business partner of someone else, of another merchant, who is mentioned in a Geniza document. This document is a legal proceeding. There is a problem of Khalaf ben Avraham taking decisions which displeased his partner, and there is a connection with Egypt, with the Babylonian community with Egypt, because there is a partly preserved name of the judge in this entire story, and the partly preserved name suggests that the judge of this document was Shemaria ben Elhanan. Shemaria ben Elhanan died in 1011, so this document was written before that date, so around the year 1000, in a script, by the way, which is very similar to the script, maybe not the same scribe, but the type of script very similar to the one of the inscription in the Codex Sassoon. So if Khalaf ben Abraham is the same as the one who is selling the Bible, and I believe that he is, because the script and chronology and circumstances allow to suppose it, we can date the inscription, the sale of the manuscript Sassoon, around the year 1000. And we know that from this document that Khalaf ben Abraham was an active merchant who acted between Jerusalem and Damascus. So we are talking about the region of Al-Sham, so the Syria from from the medieval Arabic administration point of view. So today, the land of Israel or Syria. So we can really place the manuscript around the year 1000 in that part, not in Egypt, but rather in Syria, in Asham. So I'm not committed yet to land of Israel or further northeast. So we have as well, later on, several inscriptions of waqf, waqf of Hekdesh, of dedication of this manuscript, first to a family, the family of the first buyers, his two sons, and later on, the dedication of the same manuscript to a public body. We have here two parts, two different types of dedication, Hekdesh or Waqf in the Muslim terms. Of course, Hekdesh, dedicating money, properties to a pious foundation, is already known from the Bible because biblical times, because Hekdesh existed for the Temple of Jerusalem, but we know that it was discontinued after the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, and rabbinic authorities discouraged the idea of Hekdesh when the temple does not exist. However, the Muslims elaborated a very complex legal system which was called Waqf or Hekdesh in Hebrew, which allowed on a completely different basis than the biblical Hekdesh to dedicate or give in a way goods for an institution. From the 9th century onwards, the Muslim Hekdesh includes books as a part of goods which can be dedicated, which can be established as this pious foundation, Hekdesh. What did it mean for this particular book? First of all, there were two types of Hekdesh, two types of Waqf, Muslim Waqf. One which was called Waqf Ahli. That means that within a family, an owner of a house, property, or book could make a trust, an endowment, a dedication, a waqf or hekdesh for his family, saying that this book has to remain in the family and its ownership is inalienable. The book cannot be sold, cannot be used as a pawn for a loan, cannot be divided, cannot be sold and proceeds divided. The book remains a sanctuarized property of this particular family until the family lasts. So in a way, it is the protecting the family ownership from dispersion. And this is what happened to the Codex Sassoon. This family, the family of the first buyer, was to keep the manuscript for generations to come. And we have several inscriptions on the book which certify that the two sons of Yitzhak ben Yehezkel were the beneficiaries of the Waqf. That means that they became de facto the guardians of the Codex as a family ownership. But the family must have come to an end because by the 13th or early 14th century, another stage of the history starts. The manuscript is now an endowment, a waqf, a public endowment, the waqf to an institution. Normally, in legal terms, it was possible when there was no longer the lineage of the first dedication, of the first endowment. So now the manuscript is endowed to a synagogue. We have the typical inscription of waqf, of endowment, Kodesh Ladonai Elohei Israel, and then on another page, we have the beneficiary of the second endowment, which is Kanisa Makisin. So this is the synagogue of the town of Makisin. So where is the town of Makisin? It does give us a very important historical information. So the medieval town of Makisin is the town of Markada. You see where Dura Europos is. This is a town in Syria, very close on the way between Damascus, Palmyra, and Mosul. It is in Mesopotamia between Tigris and Euphrates. This is the region of Jazeera of Syria. So we are completely in the places of one of the oldest Jewish diasporas in Mesopotamia, in today's eastern Syria, very close to the Iraqi border. Markada or Makisin was an important point because there was a crossing bridge, and it was situated on a commercial way going between Damascus and Mosul. The town is mentioned by Ovadia Hager in Megillat Ovadia. You know about this converted Christian monk who traveled to Baghdad. He converted in Baghdad. He was from a Norman monk from southern Italy, which, as we know, was conquered by the Normans in the 11th century. So at the beginning of the 12th century, he traveled to the east and ended up being converted to Judaism. And in one of his texts found in the Cairo Geniza, this is a book which it's not his notes, but it's a book talking about the story of himself, his conversion. He crossed the town of Makisin, so we have a mention of this town in this Jewish source. But otherwise, we don't have many mentions of Makisin, and we do not have any mention of the Jewish community of Makisin in any sources that I could find. So maybe someone else will discover them, but for the time being, I haven't identified a Jewish community of Makisin except for the inscriptions in the Sassoon Codex. So not only the inscription informs us about the whereabouts of the Codex, but also the Codex becomes an important historical source to tell us, aha, there was a Jewish community in this particular place. And then later on, we have as well an inscription which dates probably from the 15th century on paleographical grounds, around 1400, I would say. And this is a fascinating story. It tells us that the book was deposited with a person, Salama, and his sons, and it will remain with this family until the synagogue of Makisin and the town of Makisin is rebuilt. So we get here another important historical information, unfortunately, again, without any date, but it tells us that the manuscript was owned by the Jewish community of Makisin, and at some point, the town was destroyed. So the manuscript was kept by private people. We don't know what happened later. That's the last historical information that we have in the manuscript. We can think about the destruction of the communities, for example, during Tamerlane conquest of Syria around 1400. So it is possible that it is at this occasion that the manuscript left the synagogue and came to a private home. And from that point onwards, we can't follow it. We know that it was rebound and that Christian monasteries, probably in Syria, helped with rebinding the manuscript. So now very quickly, I don't know whether I still have time. You please stop me when I don't. I would like to talk about the paleography. What the paleography can tell us about the origin of the manuscript. So from the paleographical point of view, I would like to define the script as square of northeastern oriental type. Northeastern, that means the type of script which was created and used in Iraq, Iran, parts of Syria, and with the influence of calligraphy, which was Jewish calligraphy, just like Arabic calligraphy, which is first attested in Iraq. This style of script spread across different Jewish communities. So when we have a manuscript in northeastern Oriental script, of course, we have to think about Iraq and the East, but not only, because all the so-called Tiberian model Masoretic codices are written in northeastern Oriental square, whether they were written in Tiberias or, like Leningrad Codex, in in Egypt. So the style is northeastern and not southwestern or Palestinian style of script because of the calligraphy which crossed the Mediterranean even and found itself in North Africa and later influenced the development of the Sephardi script. So very briefly, what does it mean, northeast? I have no time for a full paleography lecture, but I would just like to show you the shape of the letter Aleph. This one is from the Codex Babylonicus 916, one of the most calligraphic books, this book of the prophets from St. Petersburg, 1b, Hebrew 1b3, so dated to 916, and this is a northeastern Aleph, and this is a southwestern or Palestinian Aleph, which comes from a Palestinian Bible with Palestinian vowels found in the Cairo Geniza, which is not dated. So very quickly, you can see a completely different proportions of the letters, splat and horizontal for the Palestinian Aleph, and the most important element, which is the treatment of the left hand part of the letter, which in the Oriental type has a wavy leg with a foot which goes towards the left, or sometimes no foot. Well, sometimes the foot can go in different directions, but the most classical one goes to the left. And very important, the left-hand part starts at some distance from the headline, whereas in the Palestinian style, there is a straight line going from top to bottom with either no foot or the foot going slightly towards the middle of the letter and up, like the Greek alpha letter. So this is a diagnostic letter, like many others, but I just give you an example to show you that even if you don't study paleography in detail, it's very easy to identify northeastern style. The Babylonian, the Codex Babylonicus, of which Aleph I'm showing you here, is a very calligraphic codex. Codex Sassoon is less calligraphic. Its square script is elaborate, very legible, quite regular, but it does not have the same level of calligraphy as this codex or Aleppo codex or Codex of Leningrad. So again, if you have a look at these two types of script, you can see completely different proportions. I have given you two examples here of northeastern Babylonian script and comparison to southwestern Palestinian, so that on a glance you can see the difference. So northeastern Babylonian, less square, less calligraphic square and very calligraphic square of Codex Babylonicus. So the regularity, the baselines, headlines are slightly different. This script is much less elaborate. However, from the morphological point of view, from the proportions of the letters, they are very similar. So for me, the Codex Sassoon belongs to this group, to the group of northeastern square script of less calligraphic pair than, for instance, the Codex Babylonicus. So this will be the script I was comparing with when I was studying the manuscript. So it contains all the typical features of northwestern square oriental script, like the serifs, these additional lines that the scribe did after he traced the bars, upper bars of the letters. It has triangular heads on the letters Gimel, Zayin, and Nun. With the letter Zayin, we have a cross-shaped letter, which is quite typical to early Oriental Babylonian manuscripts. We have the confusing length of Vav and Yud, the Yud being very long, almost like Vav, but broader than the letter Vav, which is typical for all, even calligraphic, Oriental, Northeastern, or Babylonian manuscripts. It has a relatively long descenders of the letters final Kaf, Pei, Tzade, and Kof. However, the final Nun is very short, This is a typical diagnostic feature of northeastern square calligraphic and non-calligraphic manuscripts, a very short nun, which could be confused with the letter Zayin. The shapes of Aleph are not very regular. We have different allographs, different shapes of the same letter. We have one letter in which the foot of the letter turns completely inside the letter, and others with the foot which goes towards the left. However, in all the cases of this Aleph, we have the typical form I was just showing you, which is a northeastern shape of the Aleph. The confusing shape of Hey and Het, in which the letter Hey has the left-hand downstroke firmly attached to the upper bar, and the letter P, in which the upper part is composed of the rounded meeting point between the right-hand downstroke and the nose of the letter, rather than having a long bar, horizontal bar, which is parallel to the headline, like in the Palestinian manuscripts. Shin is sharp. The meeting point between the two arms of the letter Shin is sharp at the baseline, with the middle stroke attached to the left arm of the letter. So these are the typical features. And now I would like to have a look at the Masoretes. Do I have time to talk about it? You will have to tell me, because I talk and I don't really measure my time.
Okay, so you can talk about it shortly.
Okay, so I would just summarize very shortly. Thank you very much. So yes, so we have clearly a northeastern type of script for the main scribe. There is just one main scribe, but there are corrections and additions. We have two Masoretes. It's very difficult to say whether one of the Masoretes was the scribe of the manuscript. And I'm saying if, because I'm not convinced yet, if one of the Masoretes is related to the text, it's of course Masorete 1, which shares some features with the main text. Masorete 2 worked sometime after the Masorete 1. So the Masorete 1 wrote both Masora Parva and Masora Magna. In Masora Magna, he wrote a small number of notes and only in the lower margins, never more than 2 lines or 1 line and a half. His apparatus is short, and it is laid out in 2 unequal blocks. I'm not going into it because yesterday Professor Offer has described the Masora layout. The Masorete 2, his notes are much longer, more elaborate, and we have heard in detail about the textual aspects of the Masora. He wrote his notes in long lines above the full width of the text without interruption in the upper margin and in the lower margin, where sometimes he completed the work of Masorete 1. In some places he added his apparatus to Masorete 1. In some places he replaced the Masorete 1, and I have made a list of which Masorete is attested in what part of the manuscript. We can see that in some choirs, gatherings of manuscripts. So clearly the Masoretes worked by choirs. It's likely that when Masorete 2 worked, the manuscript was not yet bound because he worked on some choirs and not the others. There are some choirs where we have only Masorete 1 and no Masorete 2. We have choirs when we have both Masoretic notes, and we have choirs in which the Masorete 2 or someone else erased the notes of Masorete 1 and added the notes of Masorete 2, and the choirs in which we have no notes at all because the notes of Masorete 1 were completely erased, but the notes of Masorete 2 were not added. So we have this work more or less by choirs. So I have made the list of how the Masoretes worked. I didn't read the Masora as such. It was not a textual study, but really a formal study of what is happening. They are both very easy to distinguish. They wrote in the same type of script, but with 2 different handwritings, and they are very distinctive. So here you can see very easily the place where Masorete 1 worked. Line 1, line 2, he stops here, And so this is the line and a half of Masoret 1 and Masoret 2, who starts writing immediately after. So the handwritings are distinctive, as are the Masoretic marks that they use to finish the Masorah or write abbreviations. So this is the marks used by Masoret 1. These are the marks used by Masoret 2, and the abbreviations, just a line for Masoret 1 and 3 dots for for Masoret 2 and 3 dots for Masoret 1. The handwritings are very different, and we know, of course, that Masoret 2 worked later because he corrected Masoret 1, but how later? So indeed, the specific different features, the Masoret 1 is recognizable by the shape of his letter Lamed, or especially a very long vav. He writes a vav which descends before the baseline, a little bit like a nun. It's sometimes short. It's actually as long as the final nun sometimes. So this is the characteristic feature, very long vav that you can see here of Masoret 1. This feature of the very long nun is found as early as the 10th century in the square script of the Babylonian Geonim. So it is really an oriental feature which is attested in Iraqi, in eastern part of the world. Here we have a letter of Nehemiah Gaon, which was written around 960, and in this letter we found a very long vav. You have it here, descending before the other letters. So paleographically speaking, we are in the eastern type of the script. So there are different shapes of the letters. This is the Aleph of Masoret 1. This is the Aleph of Masoret 2. They belong to the same style, but the scribe is different. Letter Gimel, very characteristic. It's traced in a different way by both Masorets, the letter Hey, and especially the letter Lamed, which is very short as far as the body of the letter is concerned for Masoret 2, and angular. So you can see it's an angle and the very short part here, whereas the Masoret 1 has a more regular, rounded lobe of the letter Lamed. So they are very easy to distinguish. I'm not going to go through it. However, there are some elements which can be pertinent from the point of view of the dating of the manuscript. So here again, I cannot show you the entire paleographical study, but I will show you one pertinent element. Masoret 1 likes his shin as a triangular letter, just like the main scribe of the text, sharp meeting of the two arms of the letter. The Masoret 2 has several different shapes of the letter shin, but among them there is an allograph which has a large base of the letter which is parallel to the baseline. It's completely different logic of the letter from Masoret 1. And we do find this kind of letters from the very beginning of the 11th century. The earliest manuscript I found with this characteristic, and I'm going to show it to you, dates from the 20s of the 11th century and was written in Tyre, mentions the town of Aleppo. So we are again in the region of Syria. Later on, this kind of shin is attested in other manuscripts up to the Sephardi and Maghrebi style, but early on in the 11th century, it is found in manuscripts from Syria. So we all know, of course, that there is one page 112, on which the Masoret 2 adds a note mentioning the Taj, the crown of Ben Asher, that we usually identify with the Aleppo Codex. It is problematic. Let's say that if the Masoret, less problematic if the Masoret 2 is dated indeed to the early 11th century, because at that time the Aleppo Codex was found in depending to when, either in Tiberias or in Jerusalem. We know that it was dedicated to the Karaite Nesiim of Jerusalem, who left themselves for Egypt in 1040, and we know that the Codex, Aleppo Codex, left most probably left after the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem. So if it is the beginning of the 11th century, the Aleppo Codex would be accessible in the same geographical area. But between Mackisin and, let's say, Jerusalem, it is a long way. However, we know that the scribes and people traveled. It is also possible that the mention of the Taj is not maybe the mention of a specific codex, but one of the codices of the tradition of Ben Asher, like we have manuscripts, Spanish manuscripts, which mention, for instance, the Codex Hileli or Hileli of Burgos. So we know that Codex Hileli was not one book, but several different books, which were called Codex Hileli because they represented the textual tradition of the Codex Hileli. Maybe it's the same with the Taj of Aharon Ben Asher. Very difficult to say. We don't know really today when did the Masoret II work. I think he worked in the first half of the 11th century, so not such a long time after, well, in the 11th century, so maybe not such a long time after the Masoret I worked. However, I would like to point out that when Masoret II worked, some of the notes of Masoret I were damaged. They faked away. So it is for me clear that he worked several dozens of years after Masoret I and after the manuscript was written. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Do we have time for questions? Question from Professor Ofer.
So thank you, Judith, for this wonderful lecture. I was shocked at the beginning of your words. If really Khalaf ben Abraham lived before 1011, so we have to assume that when he bought this manuscript, he said, okay, I paid much money for this manuscript, so I have to improve it. So he looked for Masran II, he gave him the manuscript and said, please improve the manuscript. Please check the text. And that's the order. I didn't think about that before I saw that the manuscript was completed, and then they begin selling it for each other. But now I think I'll speak about it tomorrow. I think that the second Masoret is later than Khalaf ben Abraham, so that may be the reason that he was involved in the creating of or improving of the manuscript.
Yes, thank you very much. So Khalaf ben Avram was the seller of the manuscript and probably a merchant of manuscripts. You know, he's attested as this international merchant. He's traveling between Jerusalem and Damascus. He works in partnership. The Geniza letter, legal proceedings from the Bodleian library talks about an investment of 350 gold dinars. So he was really a major trader. It was not a small sum. So he was trading in goods. Books were tradable goods. And we know very well in the Geniza, the most important merchants who traded in spices or precious stones also traded in books, like Nahorai ben Nisim in the middle of the 16th century. So he was a tradesman. Now, the Masoret II worked and improved the book. I do believe that when he worked, the book had an accident. I think that his improvement were done in such a way that when he could keep the notes of Masoret I, he did. So I don't know whether he was the one who erased personally by hand the notes of Masoret I, but some of them were erased. You know, when you erase the notes, you diminish the value of the manuscript. However well you write your Masorah, the scratching is visible. You can see it in the manuscript. So I think that when Masoret II worked, there was already a problem with the physical state of the manuscript. So I think it happened after it was sold.
We spoke about that yesterday, and I think that maybe after some months he worked about the manuscript, he came again to Khalaf and said, okay, I tried to improve this manuscript, but the best thing to do is to erase all the rest of the work of Masoret 1 and read it from the beginning. That's the way to bring this manuscript to be a good Tiberian manuscript. That's what I think.
Well, look, the manuscript is very important and it deserves detective story for sure. So let's write it together. There are things we will not be able to guess through paleographical analysis, but indeed, I think that we are advancing in this research too. So I am unable to say really when precisely it happened and what were the stages, whether the changes were done after the sale. What I can say on paleographical grounds is that the sale took place around the year 1000. Yeah.
Here's a question from Ira Robin.
Hello, Ira.
Very happy to see you. I have actually a technical question. Would reading the erased notes help in your discussion? I mean, if the text is damaged, changed, erased, we have all kind of means of accessing erased, faded notes.
Yes. So look, yes. So from my point of view, no. From the point of view of Professor Offer, certainly yes. Well, you never know what was in the erased notes. Maybe the Masran gave his name. That would be very nice. So yes, of course, there are means of doing it. Ira, I don't know whether you saw well the original and the notes that were erased. They were thoroughly erased in the sense that there are holes in the manuscript that were made.
May I interrupt you?
Yes.
If you remember, the ink is iron gall. You said it yourself.
Yes.
It means
it's a mixed. It's a mixed ink because when I have patches. Well, you know that I do it with my eyes. What you do with wonderful machines. Exactly. So you will have to do it. But there are places where there are wet stains. There was water on the manuscript, and then there is a black cloud on the stain. So I think that the ink was mixed. That it was iron gall with some carbon admixture Judith, because of the cloud. Judith, you will see it yourself, but...
may I interrupt you? I have reasonable hope that one day or another I will be able to study this manuscript. However, in the case of iron gall ink, mixed or not, you will have part of the ink penetrating into parchment that becomes visible to our instruments later. So I couldn't care less whether they erased it or not.
Yeah,
I can
try, Ira, try. The point is that, as I say, sometimes it was erased so well that there is a hole in the parchment, so you didn't know parchment to see.
Well, I think this isn't perhaps a comment.
But yes, but clearly it will be important for the Masorah because these are Masoretic notes, and sometimes Masoretic notes do contain historical information.
So there's scientific testing that can be done to read things that are erased, and hopefully that will be possible at the museum. Hint, hint. Okay. Do we have time for any other? Do we have time for one more question? Professor Ofer, do we have time for one more question? No, we don't.